thank you all so much for joining our presentation on the 2022 State of Software Delivery Report. We are super excited to roll this out with all of you today. A couple of housekeeping notes. If you have any questions, please feel free to drop them into the chat. We will be monitoring those and answering them at the end. And then as well, our official report will be released next Tuesday, March 15th. So all of the attendees in the audience will be receiving a copy of that report as well as a link to the recording for this webinar. So with that being said, I would like to turn it over to our panelists today. I have CircleCI's Ron Powell, Head of Insights and Strategy. And then I also would like to introduce our guest, Chris Condo, Principal Analyst at Forrester. So with that being said, I'll turn it over to Ron.
Thank you so much, Liz. I appreciate such that great introduction, and hello as well to you, Chris. Thank you for joining me as my guest today so that we can discuss what metrics are important to measuring DevOps productivity. I think that this is going to be an exciting conversation, and I'm happy to have it right now before we release year 3's State of Software Delivery Report, the 2022 version. Next slide, please. And so what I have here is just a note that CircleCI's metrics report does stand on the shoulders of giants. There are a number of folks who have presented detailed reports on the metrics that we're going to discuss today. I think the most prevalent one or the most popular one is the Accelerate report from Dora. And this is kind of an example of that. In order to measure the metrics for productivity on our platform, I look at the work that is done on CircleCI as a platform, and I can aggregate metrics across all projects that are being run. And it is an enormously large set of data, and it gives me the capacity to really help validate what I think is the information that is of value that comes from the reports that are created from survey data. Next slide, please. And these are the 4 metrics. Just to be very clear, these 4 metrics come in a lot of different flavors. In particular, because there are multiple reports every year that come out that talk about these 4 metrics. Now, all of them, especially when you write survey questions, define these things in the same way. And I want to be very clear that at CircleCI, I am only trying to define these things in ways that I can measure from the platform. And in that, I get the ability to talk about results without the bias that comes from the survey data. And in that, I also have the capacity to use an unbiased data set that validates what I believe the results from the surveys data sets include. And so real quickly, I'm going to go through and just define these 4 so that everyone on the call today knows what it is that we're talking about. On the left, I have duration here. Duration on our platform is the length of the time that it takes for a workflow to run. And so that is an engineer kicks off work on their VCS. CircleCI grabs that work, runs, build, test, deploy, or whatever combination of that you've decided to do on the platform. And then when it completes, the length of time that took is the duration. Mean time to recovery is if the work happens on the platform does not result in a positive signal, then how long does it take for you to return your pipeline back to positive? Throughput is the amount of work that you perform on the platform in a day. So that is how many times did I make changes to my product that are propagated through my CI platform. And then the success rate is a little bit easier to consume. It is how often do I make changes to my product that result in a positive, that end with a positive result. And so for these 4 metrics, that doesn't map identically to the way that these 4 metrics are represented in other reports. And so I do want to take an opportunity to point out what we're talking about specifically here. But one other thing that we're able to do at CircleCI that I think is different from what the other reports based on survey data are able to do is this next slide. Can I see that slide, please, Liz? It's create benchmarks. And so these benchmarks, I really do feel like are a gift to the community, because these aren't me just trying to give smoke and mirrors or pie in the sky type of goals for your organization. I mean, I can tell you that the results of analyzing tens of thousands of projects across millions of workflows results in seeing that these are actually attainable goals for your organization, and that there are people who are consistently beating these as goals as well. These map pretty well to what some of the other survey or what some of the other reports report as elite performance. And so I just want to highlight that being able to benchmark your team's performance across these 4 metrics is really just the beginning of the conversation. And I want to bring Chris in here as well, because Chris is someone who spent a lot of time talking to organizations about developer productivity and DevOps. And one thing in particular that I have an inability to do is to see kind of the things that are happening off of the product. And Chris has some of the ability to see some of those things. And so, Chris, just real quickly, as I've described the 4 metrics here being defined as things that I can measure on the platform, do you feel like I have a good idea or an understanding of the ways that this might be able to elevate the story so that folks who have read these other reports might be able to map these things in the conversation?
Hey, Ron, thanks very much. And thanks again for inviting me to be a panelist on this webinar. I really appreciate it. Yeah, I absolutely think so. So one of the things that's interesting is you talk about duration, and it's within the dev cycle, mean time to recovery within the dev cycle. These are very important things. A lot of I deal with enterprises. The way the analyst job works is we write a research paper on DevOps. A bunch of clients look at it and they say, how can we do that? How do we achieve that? What's the path to get adoption? How do we incorporate these into our everyday work balance? And for them, some of these numbers would be astonishing for them to be able to achieve. But at the same time, being on a platform like a SaaS platform, where it's modern, it's application delivery is done as an automated exercise. These are numbers that are achievable. And so we tell that to the enterprise, like, listen, it doesn't look possible now, but it is possible. This happens every day at software-oriented companies. But if you're a bank or you're an insurance company or a manufacturer, or you're in some sort of legacy B2B business, we worked with somebody who sells auto parts, for example, who is finding that just capturing these metrics has completely transformed how they look at their software delivery process. And so all of these 4 metrics are very important to any enterprise. The main difference is that when we talk to enterprises, their aperture is often much higher. It's like they are looking at more of a macro view, like, all right, well, the duration is great for the developer, but what about all the other things that happen afterwards? The developer gets done with their particular exercise, and now we have, other things like compliance or audits or security scanning. And so there's a lot of different things that go into an enterprise and an enterprise formula, where these are very important for them to understand how can they improve their throughput within a single team on their enterprise software development team, but they're also looking to transform their culture to be much more DevOps centric, where everyone's part of this equation versus every silo is like a different waterfall.
I think that's great. If we could move to the next slide, please, Liz. And it leads directly to my next question, which is how can engineering teams set meaningful goals in 2022? And I want to spend some time. I mean, I really feel like the folks that are in attendance today want an answer to this question, and I hope that not only can I help with gifting the folks some benchmarks as goals, but really to lean into what it means to measure these things and why there is value in that. And you spoke about some of the folks in the enterprises, in particular folks that aren't at software forward companies. That there's some blockers in adoption for these types of things, and I think it's also interesting because at those same enterprise organizations, I see that blocking doesn't happen across the entire organization. I see teams at enterprises that are able to join and move with SaaS tools for this high velocity software development. Yet there's parts of those organizations that are still behind. And so I'm curious if you have any thoughts on the teams that are able right today to measure on these four, and just like what does it mean for the rest of the organization who might be behind on their road to DevOps maturity?
Yeah, that's a great point. So one of the issues, that's a constant issue is just that software development's done by people, and humans have culture, and different organizations have different culture. Some of these, different organizations are under tremendous pressure. They have a lot of technical debt. They've got, they always talk about the analogy of we're trying to build a brand new airplane while we're flying in our old airplane, and then jump into that one without like magically falling to the ground. And so they feel like they have a lot of different entanglement with all these older issues. But the most important thing that I usually tell people is that, first of all, if you can't prioritize the work that you want to do, it's going to be very difficult to get out of that mire. And one of the things that often happens is like they say, well, the new team got to adopt the new tools and now they're doing well, but the old team that's got left behind is stuck in the mud. And so what's really important is to capture sort of like, what is the value of that legacy tool? How is it providing its value? Is there a way that maybe we can simplify the delivery of that value? Is there a way that we can quantify whether everything in the backlog is actually necessary or not by prioritizing what's important to the value, what's not important to the value? Maybe you've got duplicate elements of your portfolio that are taking up and clogging up the pipeline. There's a lot of different issues. And the other biggest problem really is just silos. A lot of enterprises operate in silos. And what you're seeing is that some companies say, we're going to break through the silos, we're going to create this tiger team, or we're going to create this new, greenfield team. They're going to work all together and they're going to get things done as like a multidisciplined team. But for some reason, it doesn't seem to take on with the other enterprise organizations. And what they'll say is like, well, they got the easy thing to do. We're doing the hard work. And so sometimes I tell people, I said, listen, if you really want to change the way the culture is, change the hardest problem now. Because if you can change the hardest problem, all the easy problems will be easy to transform. If you can get the hardest software application you own onto, a modern system like CircleCI or whatever, you can get any system onto it. You can get over all the speed bumps that governance are going to give you. You can get over all the speed bumps that security is going to give you. All those other issues that you feel are blockers, you're going to break through them with that that prototype of your first delivery, and then further honing it and becoming the professional way you deliver software on that very complicated, sophisticated system. And then all the other things will just become easier to adopt. And it's kind of interesting how culture works in enterprises and works against them. But sometimes that's a good approach, is to say, take on the big problems first, move the big boulders first. The little boulders will just follow.
No, I think it's really fascinating, and it's kind of, it dovetails really well with the four metrics. And when I talk about benchmarking, right? Because your organization, and I mentioned at the beginning of this call, I aggregate data across many projects, and so a 10-minute aggregate duration for the 50th percentile may not map to exactly what's happening at your organization. I know that there are many people who would dream of durations down at the 10-minute range. And then I know that there are some organizations that couldn't afford to let folks sit idle for 10 minutes. And so, one of the things that I think about in just kind of going, hey, there's baseline information available, is to motivate folks to create their own baselines, to go, okay, do I have insight into the performance of my own team right now? If these things are the things that the industry has decided that we should measure, and our expectations for have expectations around for productivity, where do I sit on them today? And then map that to is there an industry standard? Is there some type of information that I can find out there in the world? And I think that this is really valuable, because when you are setting goals for your engineering teams, it might not be 10-minute duration, right? It could be utilizing a benchmark for your organization so that you can start proselytizing those same SaaS tools, those same opportunities across the organization. Maybe your goal is to get a story that is more meaningful so that you can have benchmarks that the rest of your organization can then try to map towards. Some of them may find that they're operating in systems that have metrics that don't necessarily identify with an opportunity for efficiency. I mean, I would argue that that's probably an edge case there, but I mean, there is real value, I think, in, first of all, identifying that you probably show up somewhere in the spectrum of software delivery professionals that are in the space today, as a team that delivers at some level, and finding out where you're at today is the very first step in setting meaningful goals for 2022 or 2023 or any year after that. Measuring a baseline today, identifying what your goals should be today, are the ways that you create expansion across your organization for these types of opportunities and this type of efficiency, because the internal consumption of efficiency and goals and metrics is really going to drive the deeper and more critical metrics that may be measured at your organization. These 4 metrics, I think, do a really good job of sitting up really high and talking collectively about developer productivity. But at your organization, you might need a little bit more finer detail in some of the metrics so that you can have actionable insight that comes from this. Now, I think that there's still a lot to learn from the 4 metrics that we've shown, and so we can go to the next slide, please, Liz.
Actually, I got a comment on that,
sure,
if you don't mind,
yeah.
Ron. Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So, and we can leave it right here. Where do we go from here? So you talked about benchmarks, and we have companies call us all the time, like, what are the industry benchmarks for us in insurance, or us in banking, or us in oil and refinery, or whatever it may be? What we tell them is that, listen, your customer is your benchmark. You need to understand really what they're expecting. And so looking at other companies, looking at other industries isn't always so helpful. What's really important is to find out, are you actually keeping pace with the pace of business? Are you actually delivering something that people care about? And can you measure it in a data-centric way so that it's not like just opinionated? It's just like, oh, it felt like we went faster that time. You actually know, how many days did it take you? How many hours did it take you? How many minutes does it take you to get everything done? And then when you have that, as you said, you have a benchmark you can work from. You might say, all right, our benchmark today is a build takes a day. How can we cut it down? How can we cut it in half? What could we do tomorrow to cut that build in half? And those are perfectly, I mean, that's what we did, back when I was in engineering and I worked for a very large company, very modern company. We did a lot of things in a very data-driven way that was really quite interesting, because once you start seeing the data, you're like, geez, why is the build going up every day? Oh, it turned out we're building the same things over and over again. And every time I submit a build, and then the person next door to me submits a build, we're building the same thing over. We don't have to build the same thing over and over again, especially if you don't have dependencies, right? We can break that down, and we got our builds from like a day down to like 10 minutes, whatever it was. Maybe not that fast, maybe like an hour. So that's the thing on benchmarks. The other thing that you talked about is how to set meaningful metrics, how to set meaningful benchmarks, and how do you actually set meaningful goals. And one of the things that I often tell companies is, listen, if you're on like a 1-year release cycle, why don't you think about what would it take you to get a new release out the door in 1 quarter? Instead of thinking about all the junk that you want to throw into that suitcase and ship it at the end of the year, start with, I need to ship something in 3 months. What will it take for me to get there? And work your way backwards. And when you work your way backwards, you go, oh, geez, guess what? We have manual tests. That takes 3 months right there. There's no way we could possibly do it. Well, maybe you need to automate test. Well, then you work back from that. Well, how would we actually do our build takes, 3 days? Well, shrink that down. Well, we have too many features to deliver. Maybe you shouldn't be delivering so many. Maybe you should be cutting that down and thinking about how to do incremental. And we've actually seen a couple of companies actually transform that way by thinking sort of in the opposite direction. Not how do I take all of this and shrink it down to here? How do I start here and figure out what it's going to take to get that date? And so I think there's some exercises that people can use to help them get better, to achieve and be more agile and more adaptive. Because the real problem right now is people are really faking it. They're really doing waterfall, even though they think they're doing agile.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you make a really good point there. In particular, just around the folks in the waterfall paradigm, imagining that they're being more agile, and that I think is a really good point.
I have 100 items. I divided it by 10. I delivered them all in 10-piece increments. That's agile, right? And it's like, no. It's like, I always ask them, how many times have you taken something off the backlog after 2 or 3 sprints? It's like, we never take anything off the backlog. I'm like, then you're not freaking agile.
Yeah, that's not agile, and really, and that's the gift of high velocity software engineering teams is agility. And that
Right.
really is the thing. You talked about the release cycles. Your business may not need a release cycle that's shorter than a year, but there are many things that happen to your applications that need hot fixes for immediately or faster than
That's right.
immediately, like yesterday. And in those
Yes.
scenarios, you can't rely on a software delivery pipeline that takes 6 months to make a change to your application in your customer's hands. And we live in a world in which those types of changes are happening all the time, and those types of threats only increase. I mean, I can think off the top of my head just of a few things that with the open source community and using tools from that. And these are scenarios that are only going to increase. The number of folks that are utilizing software that was not written internally, like that percentage of internal versus external code is only going to increase as we get applications that are built with more and more.
It's already massively out of it's massive. It's like 80 to 90% of most applications are composed from open source components. And you're making a great point. One of the things I tell folks is that, like, when you have DevOps, it actually makes Agile much more possible because you've lowered the cost of every single delivery. Before, when you were doing things in a manual way, in a handwritten way, all those releases were expensive, risk-ridden, stressful. When you employ DevOps and you do it the right way, you've actually enabled this iterative approach to deliver small incremental changes because they don't cost any more. The change you made yesterday is no more expensive to make the change than today. And you're constantly getting in that flywheel of delivering features when you need to. That way, when you do encounter a problem like a log4j issue where you think, oh, that's once in a while, it's going to happen. Well, that was like Groundhog Day. It happened like 3 days in a row. Like, hey, they found a bug. They found another vulnerability. They found another vulnerability. Can you imagine being awake for 3 straight days trying to make those changes? You probably would have fat fingered everything. And so, but a DevOps pipeline, something that's automated, something that is, well oiled and gets the code out the door, that should have been a pretty, I don't want to say easy change because I'm sure a lot of angst went into it, making sure they updated the right, I'm not trying to diminish that, but when you have the right automation in place, getting it into production is not that hard. Making the right decisions, making the right changes, getting the approval, that's all got to happen. But if you have to then figure out how to manually release something and manually patch something, that is miserable.
Yeah, and I'm going to walk back and try and reflect a little bit on the metrics here or what have you. But in these scenarios, the ability to be agile is a reflection on the resilience of my software development team.
That's a great point too. I love that. Yes, keep going.
Yeah, in the way that I see these 4 metrics are a reflection of resilience. I don't think of them individually as things to optimize on. I think of them collectively as things to optimize on. And you had also noted earlier that one of the hard parts in the enterprise for expansion for teams is that this requires a culture change. And I do believe that this is a culture change. The 4 metrics that we talk about don't measure individual developer performance. They're metrics that apply to the software development pipeline. And therefore, the problems that exist aren't individual contributor problems. They're problems that can be leveled up to a place in which they're resolved at a system level, at a process level, and that all of the individual contributors then benefit from that at a process level.
Yep.
And so those things, those times, you give examples of like me needing to put something into production as quickly as possible. And I would always, want to go, in this scenario, my goal isn't just speed. My goal is feedback, because I constantly have to, in the scenario in which I'm making hot fixes, in the scenario in which I'm making fast patches, I need to make sure that that I can do those things with confidence, and that confidence comes from rigorous testing, right? Like, I know that I'm going to make a positive impact on my application because the change that I've made passed the rigor that I decided needed to exist in a sober moment on a different day in which things were not on fire.
Right.
And I think that's a real gift.
Yeah, Ron, I just want to touch on something that you briefly mentioned about the idea that, grading the team versus grading the individual. We always try to help enterprise leaders to shy away from grading individual developers, because the metrics aren't going to be reflective of team performance or even individual performance. I was a leader at a consulting firm, and we had a woman who was like one of our lead engineers. She had a line out the door of people needing help. She could barely get her own job done, yet 7 other projects were successful because of her help. She wasn't actually, even on half of those projects, but she understood architecture. She understood some of the more modern web things that we were getting into. And it's like, if I was going to judge her on lines of code or how many check-ins she did or how many, features she shipped, she probably would do average with everybody else. But when you take a look at the office and you saw, like, she's helping people from every single project get their job done, then it's really like more like a plus minus score in hockey. Like, how, when this person was on the ice, did they score a goal or did we lose a goal? And like, I feel like there's going to be a better way to score individual performance than based on these root metrics. So that's why I do like the idea that it's team-based, it's aggregate. It's like, how can we collectively do better? How can we collectively improve? Because people play different parts and it's very hard to single people out for individual performance. I mean, I suppose if somebody wants to look at their own metrics, maybe that's one thing, but to judge somebody on that is it can be very menial in my opinion.
I completely agree, and I think that that's one of the real value adds, that thinking of this when we solve problems at the process level. I think that we future-proof our own teams, right? Because any one of our individual contributors on our team has at least a slim chance of winning the lottery and not coming to work tomorrow. And so in those cases, and that, like, I mean, resilience for our software development teams is really the goal here. I mean, we have HR teams that bring in the talent. We can map to the stack that we're developing in and the space that we're building our application for. We have product teams that know how to, deliver the features so that we can make sure that our organization's, moving in the right direction. And so the whole goal now is to go. We're making. I mean, every organization across the enterprise, across any space, has a developer team. You can't get away without building some software at a company.
Yep.
Now, in those scenarios, the goal is to build a process that's repeatable, that's trustable, that's resilient, that has the capacity to not be dependent on an individual, and to actually be able to deliver the value. I mean, to expose value to the rest of the organization. And I think agility is one of the ways in which we expose value to the rest of the organization. When I can map my developers' time to a release cycle that's, business defined, product team defined, and I'm also every day doing the work of building resilience into my platform and then using that resilience to fight Log4j fires and so on and so forth.
Yep.
But like, that scenario is going to always be the case in which, my engineering team is providing the largest amount of value to my organization. And that, I think, is the real goal. Each one of these metrics individually, you could think of ways that they would be of advantage to your organization, but I don't necessarily think of them individually. I always think of them in terms of what is the ultimate goal from these. And I think that the ultimate goal, if I've said the word resilience enough today, the ultimate goal, if out of the 4 of them, is going to be mean time to recovery, right? Because that's the metric that says resilience to me. I know that the more times that I make changes, the more times that I have opportunity to create a change that has an undesirable outcome. And so in those scenarios, making sure that undesirable outcomes can be mitigated as quickly as possible. Like, there isn't a resilience metric that I think shows up more than in that scenario. And I mean, especially when we think of trying to map towards emergency resolution, like, the mean time to recovery is going to be the thing that makes the most sense. I know that a very long duration for a workflow to run, if you need this change to make it into production, doesn't seem ideal. But the reality is that long durations in large part are due to test suites, and so the test suite gives you the opportunity to make changes to your application and trust that the change is going to have the desired output. And so we need all of these things to happen. We need the automated testing. We need the checks and the balances, so that when we make these changes, they can make it all the way to production and do so in a way that we can trust is the output that we actually want. And we can do that with the same pipeline that also maps to my organization's monthly goals, quarterly goals, semi-annual goals, biannual goals, annual goals, and still meet that same thing. It is very difficult to, I think, go into the enterprise and help break waterfall tradition into agile software development. But I think that when we start talking about these 4 metrics as a collection, as the symbol of resilience for an organization, of I can today identify a problem, today start to identify the solution, and I know that my pipeline works in such a way that I can apply that solution today. These metrics expose whether or not that reality is a reality for you. And I do think that there is a lot of work that we can do in just making sure that first, and we talked about this earlier, first that we identify where we're at today. Releasing benchmarks, I think, is super helpful. I don't think that it's really valuable to go, there's people who get this score sometimes at some organizations and have people just kind of guess where they should go. I've looked at this deeply, and I think that I have some good ideas for where we should be for some of these things. But I think at an individual organization, the first step isn't to compare yourself to my benchmarks. I think that the first step is to go, where am I at today? What makes the most sense to be making changes? If my goal is resilience, if my goal is to be agile, then what are the ways that I can start to nurture culture at my organization so that I can build these things for the future? I mean, those are the improvements that are needed. Chris, do you have anything?
Yeah, so I have a couple of points. There's a lot in there. First of all, it's interesting that we're tying automation and these 4 metrics to resilience. I actually agree with that. That's a very nice way to show the value of having metrics, capturing metrics and meeting these benchmarks, or meeting benchmarks that are improved, and measuring your own benchmarks is a good way to measure your ability to be resilient in the face of change, in the face of failures, that happen all the time. One of the most important things that good software teams recognize is that it's not, if they're going to fail, it's when they're going to fail, and they plan for it, right? And that's what resilience means: is you plan to fail, and you have a plan to recover from that failure, and you know what all your steps are. One of the interesting things that people often think about is DevOps as a one-way street. They don't think about it as a two-way street. So, like you talked about monitoring and feedback. So, you ship something out to production, but you have no mechanized way of getting data back to find out, how do I debug this issue? And in fact, it's kind of interesting. My colleague, Charles Betts, wrote an article about MTTR. He called it the MTTR paradox, that some of these enterprises started measuring MTTR, and they found that it first went down because they got better at fixing issues, but then it went back up again because they fixed all the easy issues, and now they were stuck with hard issues. And so what the heck's going on here? And so what happens is, when you start measuring these things, you might go through these variable changes where data improves, looks like it's improving, maybe it's getting worse, and then it's getting better again. And that's just the physics almost of a system that's just starting up. It's not stable yet. Once the system reaches stability, and the automation has been proven out and everything's working, then you can expect to see more repeatable and more improved metrics. But in the middle of almost any process, whether it's manufacturing or human process, there's always variability at the beginning. So when you start measuring things, you might think, I just want a linear line, I'm going to get better. It might not happen that way. We see this all the time. They call it the S curve of DevOps adoption, where, hey, we got a small team doing it, everything is great, and then all of a sudden everyone really starts getting in. It's like, oh, it's not going so well. What the hell? This DevOps thing is really sucky. I don't like it. And then, you just got to grind it through and get it going and figure out, what are the issues? Like I was talking about before, what are the speed bumps and how do we break through them? The other thing I wanted to talk about is the fact that the focus on value, and you talked about bringing value, that resilience is value, and I agree with that. One of the things about the segue of where do we go from here is, if you can tackle these 4 basic metrics and getting all of your software engineering as a fine-tuned machine, the next thing is, what are we delivering to what's the impact I'm delivering to my customer or my end user? Is the work that we're doing meaningful? Is it helping anybody in any way? And that's another important thing, because we have companies that say, hey, we need to go faster because our backlog has 60,000 items in it. And I'm like, dude, you got bigger problems than that. You have to understand, what's the priority of those things? How old is that backlog? There are companies with backlogs that are 2 years old, and like there's like a thou shall not ever delete anything from the backlog. I'm like, nobody even remembers that stuff from a year ago. Just delete it. No one cares. But it's hard to do. You have all these kinds of silos that are working against each other. But if you're measuring the impact of what you deliver, and this gets back to the business goals, right? What are the objectives? What is the impact of this particular work stream that you're doing? Is it to improve customer satisfaction? Is the engineering team working on page load time? Are they working on transaction throughput? Are they working on user experience? Well, if you're working on something like that to improve something, there ought to be a metric to tell you if when you release the code, it got better or worse. You don't want your customer to be the person telling you that things are worse. You also should have people that are understanding which features are used, which ones aren't used, which ones are needed to make a sale, which ones aren't needed to make a sale, and try to accordingly prioritize those things. It's very important at the next level to think about the business value and tie all of the engineering effort back to a business. I mean, the very first day I was a software engineer, which was a very, very long time ago, in 1984, they said, all right, I want you to tell us why you're here in this company. This was Digital Equipment Corporation, if anyone knows who that is. And like, oh, I'm here to write software. I'm here to, test. I'm here to this. And like, no, you're here to make money. And so it's just important to tie it all back to business. Not everyone's here to make money, but that's just, what's going on. Thank you very much, Ron.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, if we can't tie this to business value, I mean, the ability to measure accurately, I think, is lost. Like that we're not doing the best for our organizations if we can't up level this story and talk about the value that we add to our organizations. I'm going to go ahead now and I think flip to the Q&A, I think, which is next. Yep. Liz, spend a couple of minutes discussing.
Let's take some questions.
If folks that are on the call still have any questions for Chris or I, please put them in the chat.
Fire away.
Yep, so it looks like we have a couple of questions. The first one being, what problems do you foresee coming from these types of metrics and data for teams as a whole?
I'll give my first.
Go ahead, Ron. Go ahead, Ron.
Okay. Yep. My first one is oftentimes I see duration hijacked from the set of metrics, and then automation becomes the only conversation. And the goal is to drive things down to as fast as possible. And we miss an opportunity for the feedback loop. The way that sometimes shows up at CircleCI is folks see that automation brings them much speed. And so they automate the first thing. And then someone else on the team says, wow, that's fast. Let me automate something as well. And they just put it below the first thing in the config file, right? And you fast forward a couple of months and there's now dozens of things in there and it takes it a long time. And so then they reach out and they go, CI doesn't work. And in that case, there's a large number of folks that can actually build that pipeline and get value out of it. I don't want to dismiss that as an opportunity for folks that see automation as the place where they can get the most value for their organization right away. I think that is a real opportunity. And so I encourage folks to invest in that if that's where you think that it should be. But in any scenario, I always want to go continuous integration is a feedback loop. And one of the benefits of the feedback loop is that in order to get feedback reliably, you need it to be quick, right? And so duration plays a large role in that, but ultimately mean time to recovery, I think, is the number that I want to be the lowest. And so I need more information out of a pipeline run. That's the information that I get from a pipeline running, the output from my tests, the richness of that output. That is what gives me the opportunity to keep my mean time to recovery as low as possible. Yeah, what do you see as the big problem, Chris?
Problems with metrics is that sometimes what happens is they become overly operationalized, where everyone's going to be graded on metrics, and suddenly like engineers are being fixed on bug bounties and are being paid by that, rewarded that way, or rewarded by certain like vanity metrics, which really don't reward people on metrics like that. It's really about the quality the team, you know, are they helping the team elevate their game? Are the products that are coming out of that team, you know, successful? Are they meeting all the needs of the business? Are these people, you know, being thoughtful and insightful as they write their code and think about problems and try to think through what's going on and, you know, collaborate well? Those are the important things about software engineering. It's a little bit of an art and a little bit of a science, you know, and a little bit of a real humanistic kind of approach. At least it is today until robots start doing it. You know, and so, you know, treat it that way. Don't just grade your engineering team by these straight up metrics. The other thing I already talked about is that some of these metrics might be variable as you start measuring them. And so, like, I mean, and I was talking about back in the day when we used to measure metrics, we did it all manual. We just like, we literally read the log files. We counted up the number of 500 errors. We put them all in a spreadsheet. And once a month, we'd start, you know, looking at them. And we started realizing, like, geez, we thought that 500 error on the website was like a once in a lifetime thing. Turns out it happens every 5 minutes, but just that when you have 1 million lines, you know, per minute in your log file, it looks like a needle in a haystack. Turned out there was 1 million needles in a really big haystack. And so, like, you know, you start like finding these issues. And that was back in the days of manual collection. Luckily, these days, there are ways to automatically collect some of this information. There's no excuse literally not to have some of these metrics at your fingertips.
Cool.
I completely agree.
Oh, perfect. A couple of questions that kind of came off of both of your answers. First one being, do you see significant difference in the metrics based on project type? For example, apps, web, services, et cetera.
I mean, I think I've done a little more of a deep dive than Chris has on the metrics, so I'll speak to this.
Please go ahead.
So, I mean, you know, there's going to be some bias in our data set towards industries that would be developer focused without any other influence. And so the IT industry is what shows up the most in our data set. And so that is an industry I think that would probably regularly outperform some of the non-software specific industries. Now, as far as like whether it's apps, like whether it's mobile, web, so on and so forth, each one of those things are also going to be somewhat variable. The benefit of adding all of the projects, whether they be web, mobile, so on and so forth, and aggregating across all of them is really just to give an idea of the range. Because I think that any individual project is going to have to start thinking about how often they deliver to their customer, what the need is for that delivery cadence, how often changes are made to the application, what the need is to deliver those changes, whether they be instantaneously all the time in a continuous delivery or continuous deployment type of paradigm, or whether you package them, they come out in the evening. I mean, like, so many of those types of variables are really going to define the way that your individual company is able to get value out of utilizing a service like CircleCI or another continuous integration tool. And so project by project, it is more difficult to make these types of comparisons. Especially because, you know, in modern, even, I mean, in mobile and web, most applications are still being, you know, today are built out of microservices. And so an organization, whether they be, if they develop a mobile product, they may have hundreds of projects that all run on CircleCI under the same organization. And so any one of those individual projects would probably also have a different metric that you would want to target. I do find it interesting to get all the way down into the project level and have the conversation down there, but I don't necessarily see a lot of opportunity when I look at one vertical compared to another. Oftentimes, I think that the real value in identifying the baselines for a particular vertical are just for the other folks in that vertical. And so For mobile application development, I think that you would want to probably find not just mobile applications, but if you're an e-commerce mobile application, I mean, it's because you would want to find someone that maps to the same release cadence and try to like kind of understand what their business's value is, how they would define ROI, and then what the goals would be for an organization like that. And any of those types of conversations at an individual level, I think start with like, what are my, where am I at today? Duration, mean time to recovery, success rate, and throughput. What would it mean to try to increase or decrease? I mean, whichever, optimize any one of these. And then if I make these types of changes, what does it result for my organization? And we've talked a lot about resilience, agility. These are the things that you get for your organization. So in that lens, I think of it less in terms of, can I compare myself to other folks in the mobile application industry, and more, can I utilize the tooling that modern application development is happening on, so that I can get the value add for my company in the best way that I can. I hope that is helpful.
Yeah, I have like kind of a side comment on that. So one of the things that we're hearing from our inquiries is that some people actually have found that they're releasing too often, or the companies themselves that are accepting releases, like, we just can't consume it that fast. We actually heard this from people that were dealing with Azure DevOps as the installed version. Like, comes out like, once a month. We can't update it once a month. It's just too fast. And so it's really important. Like, I mean, how many times is your iPhone updated? I mean, like, do you want it happening every night? You really have to understand your client, what their expectations are. If you're delivering accounting software to an accountant, the last thing you want to do is update them on April 15th or her, because they're in crunch time, unless it's a critical issue or something like that. But really understanding your client, what the expected cadence is, and how to, if you think you need to improve the cadence, what benefit does it give your users? And really understand how they're perceiving that. So that's one thing. The other thing that the question touched on is the fact that individual stacks might have individual performance numbers. So somebody who's developing on Android in your company might have a completely different life cycle than somebody delivering on iOS. If they're both developing native apps, they have to deal with those respective stores to get their application updated in there. There's a lot of there's different kinds of rigmarole that goes into it. And so what they really should do is understand what their benchmark should be, and then just maintain their own benchmark and measure it and try to improve a benchmark if it makes sense. There's also the notion of diminishing returns, where I want to go faster, I want to go faster, I want to go faster. Well, maybe going faster isn't necessary. Maybe going better. Maybe putting your investment in some other aspect of your product would be more beneficial than just simply going faster. Maybe you should experiment with new variations and try hypothesis-driven development and try to put some energy into that. It's not always about speed. It's about moving fast with intelligence and with deliberate, product-centric thinking, not just blindly going fast for the sake of going fast.
Cool. So another question, expanding upon, Chris, I believe you had started to touch on this before we open up the Q&A, but do you have any tips or tricks for tracking the metrics, for example, in the CircleCI native UI or other tooling without rolling your own, going to Hydria, et cetera, yep, or roadmap items for it, perhaps? Yeah,
so like I said, back in the day, 10 years ago, at Microsoft, we basically just took log files or wrote our own counters. We figured out, what our build time was. We figured out, the different kinds of errors and issues going on. We had tools to measure page load time. We had tools to measure, we had tools to measure the development metrics. We had tools to measure the product metrics, and we combined them together to get a complete health of the product stream. We didn't just look at the software engineering metrics themselves. We collected those in an old-fashioned, Excel workbook, and every month we would review them. We call it a business review, where the product team was there, the test team was there, the development team was there, and we all just read through all the metrics, and we all felt shameful if we didn't improve them, or noticed that somebody made a drastic improvement on their team that maybe I could borrow. What did you do? How did you get that improvement? And so, in some strange way, even though we thought we were all being called on the carpet, it actually became a very nice collaborative moment where different leads can understand what are the trips and ticks you're doing to help your team go faster. How are we collectively all working together to deliver greater value? These days, we write about a lot of different ways. CircleCI themselves has I'm not going to talk too much about it, but they have their own platform for measuring metrics. They have a partner that they work with. There are tools called value stream management tools that you can buy and integrate into your software delivery pipeline to capture these metrics. They go deeper than these 4 metrics, and so or more expansive rather. And so you can decide, to what degree you want to capture that. There are also tools that will just simply try to read your log files and try to connect the dots and sort of determine what the metrics are. But I'm not sure, those really depend upon the quality of the data and how well, all the things are connected together to give you that data. But there's a lot of different tools out there these days that provide these metrics. They're called different things: value stream management tools, or DevOptics, or developer optics, or developer observability tools. They go under a lot of different names. But one thing we are seeing as a trend is almost every major provider, especially the SaaS providers like CircleCI and others in the market, are providing these or trying to provide these built into their products, so that teams can instantly get benchmarks from the day that they start working on those platforms. But I'm guarantee if you're using Jenkins from 5 years ago, there's probably a plugin to give you some metrics if you want to.
Yeah, I mean, I could, my area of expertise is a little bit more aligned with the CircleCI platform, so I will speak to that.
Oh, go right ahead. No, I was just trying to be broad about it. That's all.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, and I think broad is helpful here, because I don't necessarily think that I mean, none of this is specific to the CircleCI platform. That we have a dashboard that displays this through insights is a feature, but as you said, it's a feature that gives parity to the platform. It's not a differentiator by any means. And so, to speak a little bit to the native UI's representation of the insights through the dashboard, the attempt to try to generalize what might be the most meaningful way to display that information to you is still something that we're taking feedback on. I mean, and I would say if there's anything that you have as far as ideas if you have your project on CircleCI and you have it set up to report insights into the dashboard and it's not providing you with the information that you need, that would be incredibly helpful feedback. And I would encourage you to hit the support team and make those suggestions. I will also say that in service of trying to give the largest amount of value to our customer base, it is pretty generic what is originally exposed there. And I think that it does you a good service to understand what types of metrics and what you can pull through the API is, so that you can get a little bit more richness and a little bit more closeness to your projects, and maybe even pull the actionable insight that you might have been looking for. Again, I do think it's really helpful information to get any feedback on the way that CircleCI is currently displaying the 4 metrics and whether or not that is helpful or not. And I'll also add a plug for the API, which will pull a richer set of information for you as well.
Cool. So in the interest of time, we have about 5 minutes left. The final question, I think, is the perfect kind of exit point for this. Overall, is there a particular metric that you would place the most emphasis on, or any kind of final words on the metrics as a whole?
Chris, I'll let you go.
I think Ron already talked about it. It was the MTTR, right? I think the idea that you can first of all, determine that you have an issue. That's the first thing. Understand what the issue is, fix it, and then get it back out the door. I think that just shows you the health of your whole software development tool chain right there. I think that's a great metric.
Yeah, I mean, like we deal with inefficient systems where that's the world in which we exist. And so the only problem with inefficient systems are when we act surprised when the inefficiency shows up each time. And so the mean time to recovery is me recognizing that error will show up in my application pipeline. It will. And making sure that I have a mitigation strategy for that is my ultimate goal. That's what makes my team the most resilient. That's what makes them the most agile. And Liz, that was a fantastic question to close on. Chris, I want to take this opportunity again to thank you. It's always a great conversation that we have together. I wish we had even more time. We could spend all day on this, I'm sure.
Yep.
But I do really appreciate that you were kind enough to join me today on this panel. For the
My
audience,
pleasure.
I'd like to,
My pleasure,
yeah.
Ron. Absolutely my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Honored.
thank you. And to the audience, thank you all for attending, the folks that made it all the way through to the end, especially. I appreciate all of that. And I'll turn it over to you, Liz, for the closing remarks.
Yep, thank you so much for joining. We really appreciate it. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, you all will be receiving a copy of this recording as well as the report when it launches next Tuesday, March 15th. So please keep an eye out in your inboxes for both of those assets. And again, thank you so much, and do not hesitate to reach out to us if you have any additional questions, feedback, or follow-up. We really look forward to it, and thank you again.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.